Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started then? Thanks everyone for coming. We would also like to thank MindSource for sponsoring this training. And we'd like to thank Jamie and Veronica for coordinating this as well. We are very pleased to have Dr. Doreen Martinez with us today. We really appreciate you designing and offering this training for us. Dr. Martinez is Mescalero, Apache, and Pennsylvania Dutch. She was born in San Antonio, Texas, yet raised in Pennsylvania, her family being the only Martinez in the phone book. She is a transnational Indigenous epistemologist with a PhD in sociology. She is a professor at Colorado State University, and her scholarly expertise is in Indigenous knowledge systems, research methodologies, visual culture, and socio-political land and environment issues. Dr. Martinez has presented on numerous related topics, has been and is currently engaged in a number of projects, and has authored many book chapters and scholarly articles, among other scholarly activities. She focuses on how traditional knowledges, the grounding and inspiration of our lives, is engaged and practiced every day. She is an avid advocate of alliance building and promoting justice. And thank you for being here, Dr. Martinez.
Sure, I definitely appreciate the invitation, and I want to say, like, those bios at times I do a little bit. It's like, did I write that? But it's this, it's this also the variety of different spaces that I have to be in, and I'm called upon, and what they look for, and what they expect. And I understand, and I've had some time to talk to Susan and actually Raya, that you're all practitioners, so there's a lot of what I'm going to offer had certain kind of grounding, because I think it's actually important in terms of the work that we do, that it's grounded. Yet there is specific things I'm going to bring in that I think are going to relate a little bit more to, what does it mean to be practitioners in the field. I've done a host of community-based projects with tribal peoples down in Aurora, Denver, on health equity issues. So I'm pulling in from those experiences also. I've worked with the Colorado Trust, the United Way, the Philanthropies Organization, Anschutz Hospital. I mean, a variety of different places. I'm going to be pulling those things in. And I want to say that, Zoom is the pro and con, right? It makes some things, easier and accessible, but then it's also, I'm very Socratic in my style, and I love to feel the energy that's coming from people and reading nonverbals. And this is where we get a little bit more limited. And then even when I share my screen, it gets even harder in terms of seeing people. But we really do want you to utilize the chat in terms of even reflections, responses. And then we're actually going to also share with you just an open Google Doc. And that, one of the things I experience sometimes when I do these is that there's such a powerful offering from a variety of different people, and we can miss the capture of it. Although we're recording of it, sometimes it's different in terms of, do you re-watch a recording, or do you look at a Google Doc in terms of, some of the things that you can put in there, and then we can even work to synthesize and summarize and kind of organize that. But I think that at least starting to get people to jot things down, it could be additional questions, observations, things that you're making connections to, anything like that. And at times the benefit is maybe and maybe you get it, but where is it that we can emphasize and then share with other people as we do this kind of effort and this kind of work, because it is work. I have a notepad over here that I do take notes with also as I walk through this. And I don't know, it could be in the next 5 minutes, or it could be an hour down. My cat will probably jump on the desk because she hears me talking. So just forewarn you, and she'll yell and scream otherwise. So it's easier when she just is popping on the desk. I really do want to open up that if you have a wealth of people who have a number of years of experience and their own expertise, and that if there are questions and or insights that you all have, please, raise your hand, wave your hand, raise it, emoji it, whatever it is. Susan has said that she's going to try to keep track of that also, because we want to bring people in. So I have prepared a set of slides and information that I really see us, maybe spending an hour, a little over an hour on. We're going to then do a small group breakout session because of the numbers of us. And I guess we actually just probably got another 5 or 6 people here in the last minute. So that's awesome. So we had already planned on doing smaller breakouts in which I have a couple prompts, but also just want that time for you all to be sharing with one another, reflecting and seeing what we might be able to get out of this offering. When I was contacted to do this, we definitely had some conversations around what are you seeking to achieve? And I think that there's different levels, and do know that some of what I'm offering, I think, might be a little bit more foundational. I didn't focus, I stayed away from some of the focus of generational trauma, boarding school, some of those things. I wasn't really thinking that that's what was being asked for, but we can bring some of those things in if necessary. Again, just base knowledge. I have been teaching and doing the work for almost 30 years. So I generally have some capabilities of answering most things. I'm not a counselor, so I'm not answering that, but kind of where those show up and how those show up. Certainly I have knowledge of, teen suicide rates, addiction issues. I mean, all of those kind of things come up, as much as I also have awareness of particular practices, in which I'm going to highlight some of those that might be more familiar to people from an Indigenous background, but just kind of setting that up. I'm going to start sharing my screen here just to kind of get us also visually tied together. And actually, let me start with good old presenter view.
And you won't be able to see us then, right?
Yeah, that's why I need you.
Okay. Yes.
I can see some people, but it definitely starts to truncate the number of people I can see. I only see like 4 or 5 right now. So that's also like if somebody's putting in the chat and those things. So again, this is a title slide. And in some of the things in which I was considering what you all were looking for, the title to me was like reaching outreach. And, I definitely have this tendency to put it like, try to be creative in the titles and maybe be pun, but reaching outreach. I think that that's something that we seek to do. We think we're doing outreach, but maybe we need to think about how do we reach outreach. Certainly your organization is called a Brain Injury Alliance. So I was like fostering alliance. And I saw this more about extending beyond just the folks that are part of the official alliance to how do we foster alliance to literally those communities and individuals and people's and beliefs potentially even that we seek to serve. So that's kind of where I was starting with that title, and wanted to be able to also frame it in. And again, this is what I'm offering. This is really an Indigenous locating of Indigenous ways. So I'm looking at grounding us in that space, at least for the time that we're here, to then be able to transition, how do we take this information and utilize it? And again, that's just who I am. And Susan had read a little bit more about my bio, which I always think that it's poignant to highlight that we were the only Martinez when I was growing up in Pennsylvania, but I am Muscalero Apache. So that's another conversation too about how that happened. But I want to move on to my next slide, because this is what you all were actually asked, what might you want in this conversation? And what are some specific things in which you're actually seeking in my offering? So and again, Susan was able to kind of categorize these. I'm going to talk about each of these right now for a little baseline, and then we're going to get into some specifics, and then demonstrate potentially some of the things in which we're actually being asked and sought in these three kind of areas. So no doubt the first one is barriers to support services. And the questions are, what are some reasons and barriers people of Indigenous communities may face in seeking and receiving support, systematic problems, cultural considerations, how folks can be supportive and sensitive to this? I'm going to offer much more time on the cultural considerations, in part, and you all can correct me, but I would think that many of you are fairly aware of the systematic problems. The lack of access issues of even health insurance. I mean, the systematic problems. And again, if we want to come back to those, we can list that. It's everything from is there transportation to can I get time off on a job? So if you need more conversation around the systematic issues, we can get into that. I would just, again, maybe incorrectly, but in some ways assuming that a number of those are fairly well known in your group. And again, I have time at the end of the session to come back to things in which we might be looking at more specifically. I would say the one thing that in the consideration of systematic problems that at some level you all probably experience more so is that you're urban. The native population, that we're, going to be encountering, it's urban. We really, nation territories have to go, again, for all its, south, west corners in terms of territories. So I mentioned that one specifically because it may end up literally falling through the cracks, right? Because we can name a number of things that might be more systematic, literally bus transportation, health insurance, those kind of things. And then we can even look at, like, on nation territory, the issues of, the Indian health services and some of those. But the urban population does have, I think, a way in which often gets erased or invisible. That is a systematic issue. So that would be one of the things that I would bring up and raise to some level for a number of you all, is like that invisibility. You have the Denver Indian Center. It's more west. So I don't, and I'm just saying this from my experience. I know that a number of people, urban Denver, can have difficulties accessing that. And I should also backtrack that I know that the alliance is across Colorado. So some of you might be, in a situation where you're working with tribal populations, but I was just also thinking of that significant thing in terms of the invisibility of Native populations. Right now, I work in a lot of different groups, and there's always this issue about how to serve Native issues. And there's this notion that I have to have a physical body in front of me. And, we're in a very different situation in terms of our state. So again, the systematic issue of invisibility and erasure is huge in terms of the urban Native population. A quick idea of how do you attend to that? I think it's literally the classic thing: brochures, advertising. What are you putting out in terms of marketing? How are you phrasing those kind of things, so that you can see and start to attend to that invisibility. The urban issue. You have a couple of school systems that I actually know of that have created groups that work very specifically, like with Native youth. Another way you can get at that issue of urban, there's a number of other organizations that I would be looking at tapping into that specifically are looking at helping and addressing that urban tension. So those are quick kind of answers to that systematic issue, and particularly the urban one. I'm going to spend a whole bunch more time on the cultural considerations. And some of those other things in terms of being supportive and or sensitive, so to speak. If we need to come back to the systematic issues, please put it in the chat, put it on the Google Doc. And did we share the Google Doc link so that folks can even start to jot notes on that?
Yeah, we didn't share it yet. And I think I'm also missing emails from Ken and Maria. So if you can put them in the chat, I'm sending to all staff. And then Liz, sorry, who else do I have? And Lena and Lena. So if you're BIAC all staff, Liz or Lena, I have your email. If you're not, please put it in the chat for me and I'll send it to you.
Great, that's helpful. And again, the reminder with the Google Doc is to start to jot down observations, connections. It's like that way in which, you want people to be engaged in terms of taking notes. And it is something in which we're seeking to actually share and help post this. So also trying to make sure that this doesn't just end up being a Friday afternoon engagement. So that's the first one. And so that would be something on the Google Doc. Are there barriers to the support services, and particularly the systematic issues that we need to continue to consider? Again, I'll do more cultural considerations here as I jump into more substantive pieces of the presentation. For the cultural appropriation and language use, that question and that summary, is it cultural appropriation? How do Indigenous people feel about non-Native people using terms like spirit animal, two-spirit, powwow? For example, we had a powwow about that. And this is one of those that literally, if we were sitting in the room, I'd ask you this question back, in some ways, and not just have me answering. So if anybody actually wants to jump in, is like, what do y'all think? And again, I need help in terms of if somebody's raising their hand, because I can't see everybody. Somebody want to actually take an a moment? What do you think in terms of how might Indigenous people feel about, use of words like spirit animal or two spirit or?
From what my experiences from what I have learned is that generally it's quite frowned upon because typically those are referring to very specific and often sacred practices, elements of their culture, and oftentimes those are not how they are being used by white folks when they're using them. So typically, in my experiences, they are not widely appreciated.
Yeah, and I totally appreciate whoever jumped in there. That and I would say consistently, in part of what was just offered, there's so many other things about that language. Language is expressions, and particularly some of these, like the history, the responsibility. I often come back to so many situations is that people are foregoing responsibility. That by and far, it's I would say the other one that's actually super trendy right now is like people all of a sudden belong to tribes. And it's like, oh, I go hang out here, and this is my tribe of people. It's highly offensive, to be honest with you, because like what it means to be a tribal member and all the responsibilities around that. I want to highlight this issue of appropriation, though, because it is one for Indigenous peoples by and far. It's profound, it's exponentiated, it's everything from, again, the tribe, the language, and I'll get into one of these a little bit further because I think it's a little bit more of an issue that, there's been different decades in which you've seen really high jumps in the census population with people who identify as Native. The first big jump happened in the 1960s. Anybody else around in the 1960s? What was going on in the 1960s, and why might we see a different way in which people start to identify themselves? Come on, I gotta have a couple other people who were around in the 60s, not just me. I was really young. I was young, but I kind of have an idea.
Well, the war.
The war, right? And think about the war in the ways in which, like, who wants to be like the enemy, who's like the good person, right? Post the war, we really have free love, sexual revolution. Everybody's like, this is hippie generation. I'm coming to know myself and all this identity. So you saw a huge surge in people identifying as Indigenous in the 1960s. That was one of the first. We had another bump somewhat in the 1990s. And there's different reasons why people are thinking about that. Some of it is literally this movement away from different populations. There was a lot more movement. And what I mean by movement is there's a lot more people moving, in this way in which people were seeking identity. We're right now, though, in one of the most massive situations in terms of people all of a sudden identifying as Indigenous. And it is in many ways the byproduct of Ancestry.com. Where all of a sudden people are doing blood tests and there's something like down the line, some genealogy thing, as I had like the great, and it could be like 6 generations, somebody saying, or again, this percentage of, blood shows up that I'm Indigenous. And all of a sudden there's like, everybody's like, well, I'm Indigenous. And I literally just had a conversation with somebody the other day about this. And like, many of those Ancestry.com or DNA tests also show that people have Irish ancestry, or maybe even African ancestry, or maybe this, but the only one they pick, and then all of a sudden seek to become is Indigenous. So it's a very significant issue, in part because a number of these things in terms of identity, it can also be tied to resources and can also be tied to sovereignty. And it's much more complicated. And I think that also heightens then some of the concern around cultural appropriation, because it does potentially do more harm. Those are the things that we want to consider. I think easily, if there's language such as spirit animal, it seems like it's another space in which some of our traditions get commodified, because they often get changed in these situations, and somebody else is benefiting off of that. You can see this. You can go online and even like do a search for spirit animals, and I bet you some people are selling them. There's just this way in which it's become this industry, which is also such a concern to Indigenous peoples and traditional peoples. I know that somebody just, I think 2 weeks ago, said like, I'm going to have a powwow. And they looked at me and they go, I don't think I should use that word. I'm like, yeah, not really. Because I said to them, I was like, well, what are you doing in return for having the powwow? Again, because there is practices of reciprocity that are much more significant. The one that's mentioned here that I do think that maybe a little bit more complicated is two-spirit. I would say that particularly it's a word that has been adopted across a number of spaces. If many people, again, there is this, I even use the word like traditionalist, there's a struggle with it because it creates a certain kind of gendering and sexualization that is false in Indigenous communities. A word that you would hear much more often around gender and sexuality practices, and particularly gender, is egalitarianism. And like it's spread and it's shared. And so as soon as you do two-spirit, you make it Western because it does this thing of male, female, homosexual, heterosexual. So some people really actually are it's not even so much offended, it just doesn't work, but it's been adopted. And I actually have seen in some spaces they're going to three-spirit, and they are changing that because it actually isn't appropriately reflective. It got to be used in a space too where folks were, it became like the cool way to identify. And I don't want to be disparaging because I know that there's a number of people identify, yet we want to place that in its proper spaces regarding what people are seeking to attend to. I could see you all serving people potentially who identify as two-spirit and are Native, but I could see you serving people that identify in two-spirit or non-Native. So some of this that's different in terms of how do you, because there's a prioritization of service and people's needs, but overall it's definitely one of those that's much more fraught. So that to me at times is like, if we can think of other ways to express that, it's going to be better than to engage in the fraughtness of it. So cultivation, again, language of, again, the tribe is the big one right now. And you can then get the appropriation with tribal tattoos. They drop down a little bit. But then there's other ways in which people, clothing, attire, the way they talk. Yeah, there's definitely a lot here in terms of an overall way in which Indigenous peoples struggle with that. And when I say struggle with it, it isn't potentially our default to confront people about that. Our younger generation will do a little bit more. And some of this is because we have a lot of other things to attend to. So like I may not pay attention to that, but the call out culture, oh yeah, it definitely has done that. So there's a generational thing in which you might hear more youth actually really jumping on that too in terms of addressing it. That's that area. This will come up in some of the other slides that I have. And again, I'm just going through these as primary questions because like you have those, I can answer these pretty quickly and then we're gonna go through some more stuff. So how important it is to understand the meaning and use of land acknowledgement statements and how do Indigenous peoples folks feel about these? If an organization uses one, should they be finding action? Okay, so here's the buying far. Land acknowledgement statements right now, in terms of kind of the overall feel, is that they're empty and they're aesthetic. Somebody even, they call it visual, like a visual pandering of sorts. Like it's just being used in so many organizations to make them potentially feel better or feel like they've achieved something visually. And this happens college campuses, corporations, businesses, nonprofits, that they almost like really took off as like the absolute answer to all the wrongs. And so by and far they're critiqued heavily right now, pretty significantly. I will say that I definitely think that there are certain populations who find a bit of reprieve in it though, and almost a kind of a nod of like, finally we're being recognized. So I wouldn't throw it out entirely, but when you're going to hear people be in some ways have a certain kind of happiness that they're there, it's personal. That's like, wow, we finally are being recognized. But institutionally, organizationally, structure-wise, if you would create one, I would say you need to be ready to be critiqued. And particularly if you create one absent of this last sentence. So the last thing is the big thing. If an organization uses a land acknowledgement statement, should they also be finding ways to take action, support Indigenous communities in other ways? Absolutely. Absolutely. No doubt. Absolutely. And I would even consider, if you're going to put together a statement, how are the other activities and things in which you're doing are reflected in the statement itself? So that people don't, because if people just see the statement and don't really see that you're doing these other things, it's going to be very offensive. Right, easily right now, there's been, I can, give you links of articles and videos and other things in which there's been some tremendous amount of critique. And I think it's because it became just another popular thing for people to do. I would encourage you, if you have minimal resources, I would highly encourage you to think about what else you can do to take action to support Indigenous peoples before you spend money creating a land acknowledgement statement, to be honest with you. Like that to me would even be the first step. Do the other things, because I know money and time is always limited, and I would do the other things first and foremost. I will though say that, you know, CSU has a land acknowledgement statement. I was actually part of helping create it. We created a video. This was like probably one of the earlier ones. It did start to raise the conversation. So they're not entirely wrong, but right now, if you do it, it's going to land in another way that I don't think you necessarily want to step into. So that's just the general, again, immediate feedback on some of your questions. And I'm going to get into some more specifics and give you a lot more content in terms of illustrations. But again, I can see Jamie. I can't necessarily see if there's any other questions or anything else. Again, the Google Doc has been posted. So just hopefully let me know if there is anybody else coming up in terms of questions.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
My name is Nico. So going back probably to number 2, so and please correct me if I'm wrong. So if somebody, so if and again, please excuse if my language isn't.
Oh, no,
so
you're fine.
if a Native American marries a white woman or vice versa, whatever, and they have a child, or a Hispanic or Latino or whatever, and they have a child, and they go to, I don't know, can they, or if they speak in such ways, are they looked at in a different way, especially that of a white Caucasian person? You understand?
I'm not, I think I'm getting you. There's intermarriage all over the place. I think there's definitely this way in which there's certain language, like how are you showing up consistently? So if I'm showing up at like, I don't know, like the fun things, but I don't show up to do the help things, yeah, I think you're looked at that. I don't necessarily know if that's drastically different than a lot of other people. You know, there's things that tie into that though, in terms of enrollment. There are ways in which Indigenous peoples, you know, part of the byproduct of good old, you know, colonialism is that we've taken on particular kinds of interpretations and judgments. And like, are you enrolled or are you not enrolled? Those are more complicated questions. I can certainly explain that if we have time more in terms of how that works, but that tends to be something that is an indicator at times of whether or not people might be seen, and even their kids, as somebody who's in the in group or out group, right?
So I think,
go ahead.
So I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino, but I married a Native American and we had a daughter. So he's 99% Native American. He didn't help, right? So he didn't help raise her. So she wasn't raised around that. I didn't raise her around the culture or the, you know, I never, to be completely honest, took her to powwows, or, you know, we never went to her family's native where he was from. And so, you know, at any point she finds interest in her culture, or even if she doesn't, right? So does that, and her children, so does that like make them any less of Native American?
Well, it comes back down to how do you practice, and it'll come up in terms of some of the other slides that I'm having in terms of how do you practice who you are. So there's no doubt that there is the blood quantum in some ways in what you're talking about, which is like what percentage, and there's this blood issue, and that gets into enrollment. You know, you have people who are enrolled though that have zero connection to their nation and their traditions. So it isn't always just about being enrolled. It's how do you practice what that means, you know, and whether it's your daughter or your daughter's kids, you know, and unfortunately they lost the connection in terms of the biological, I want to say donor, but I don't know you and I don't want to offend that, but you know, the biological component, but are there other family members or are there other ways? I think that to me, I have students ask me all the time is like, connect to the community, connect to the family, a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, something, that I don't have the ability for there's 574 federally recognized tribes. Everybody's going to do it to some level differently. There's over 200 that are seeking federal recognition. So it's very important to, as much as you can, specifically try to engage in that. If you can't, there is urban engagement. There totally is. Because Denver was what was referred to as a select city during the Federal Reorganization Act, which basically means you had a lot of Native people from a whole bunch of different nations literally get relocated to Denver. So you have an urban population, and maybe your daughter and or others in that situation can get involved in that type of activity, which tends to be more pan-Indian, but has particular traditions and particular teachers to do that. School systems more and more are actually facilitating some of these programs for youth and or even community. I know a bunch of community organizations are doing it too. So those are some other places I would start to look. But I can't say specifically, is she or not? I mean, again, to me, there's a piece where like you get certain things, potentially biologically, physiologically, but so much of it is about how do you practice and how do you know the traditions. Unfortunately, we have that's some of the loss that we have because of the different ways in which people were forced off of their lands, forced into different communities, so forth. But let me get into some of the other things, and then again we can come back to that if it's something else in which people want to get a little bit more insight into. Does that sound good?
Yeah,
Again,
thank you so much.
yep. I want to start then with, to me, when I'm thinking about offering to you all, and again, some of it is this larger conversation is like, how do you make sure that we're decreasing barriers to support? A big thing for me to decrease those barriers of support is that if you have somebody come or again, you make contact with, because I would imagine with some of your work, you're literally getting called upon if there might be somebody who's in an accident or so forth. There's probably multiple ways in which you're potentially meeting people or even families. It's like, how much do you understand who they are? And I'll even get into some specifics about how they might even carry themselves bodily and some of those things. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just kind of giving more insight into what framework in terms of thinking. I often refer to this as ways of being, and like, so what is my way of being in the world? I think that these are some of the things that are the barriers. So that even when I come into contact with somebody, or maybe in line, it's not just even the first meeting, but the third or fourth, that if I'm foregoing or even negating understanding where people are coming from, that's the barrier, because then they won't open up into you, or they don't necessarily want to see you again. There may be issues of trust. There's so many other things. So I wanted to go through a little bit of this in terms of kind of in a fundamental way, how do Native peoples understand themselves and how we would practice this as kind of ways of being, showing up in the world, right? And there's a pretty consistent understanding that who we are and what we know comes from this ancient cultural consciousness. And, I don't necessarily think you're going to get people going to say like, hey, here's my ancient cultural consciousness, right? That's not what we do. But it is this way in which I think you will get people who discuss a process, literally this quote here, which is mine, but discusses a process of knowing that honors and integrates the past. You will consistently hear Native people talk about ancestors. They do. We talk about ancestors on a regular basis, right? We talk about the traditional ways, we use that kind of language, right? But that embeds this reciprocity of the present. So that literally, and the one thing that I had just said just a little bit ago, which was also this issue about cultural appropriation. If people aren't offering something back, and it isn't a binary give and take, it literally is a collective. So what am I doing to serve the community? What am I even doing to serve my ancestors? What am I doing literally that offers back for the futures? So there is this reciprocity that is very, very rooted in terms of the present, because it also then encapsulates this responsibility of the future. Many of you probably heard the idea of 7 generations. Very true. And if it's not 7 generations, does anybody need, again, put it in the chat or on the doc if you need that defined. But there is this definite consciousness of the future that I'm always thinking about. Even a recent conversation I had with a group yesterday with some Indigenous peoples in that project in Guatemala, they wouldn't use the 7 generation language, but they definitely understand what it means in terms of our responsibility to our grandchildren and to our futures. So these three, that very cognizant connection to ancestors and traditions, the way in which the present must be more than just me. A heavy part of this is moving away from being human centered. This, I think, can show up in your spaces in very maybe less aware ways in which, like, the human centered piece. And I'm going to give you an example that even more specifically, but also this responsibility future. So here are the things that might come up in terms of like that reciprocity, the present, is that it's a really short story, but I had a friend of mine whose mom, we went over to visit, and she had this plant. And we went and visited like 3 or 4 times, and she always would ask me, like, what do you think of the plant? She'd always ask us, like, what do you think of the plant? And it was really funny when my friend were like, why does she keep asking about the plant? Like, because it was like 3 or 4 times. We were actually really confused. And then the one time we just went over, we're like, and she asked again, and we're like, what is it about the plant? Like, is there something like we're missing or something? Like, she's like, well, I actually want you to hang it up. Like, because she had this hook. But yeah, that you won't ask directly. And part of not asking directly is because my understanding of the present is I have to keep things in balance. That's the idea of reciprocity, right? So she's hinting to us. So I would say this, and she's not the only one. People will hint more than ask directly. And I think you need to be cognizant of that, because again, why I'm hinting isn't because even shy or afraid or kind of like, able to or incapable to. It is literally a process of what it means to be in a collective. So I might hint at things or suggest things, and that's just one of the ways in which you can see that. And again, the future becomes something in which you're going to see people act upon, because they may literally forego maybe some services or maybe some other help because they're concerned that they're taking things from others for the future. And it may not be that I'm concerned just for my family member, but I might be concerned in that, oh, this might be that there's too many people paying attention to me, so to speak. So you want to think about that future idea. And I know that some of you know this in terms of like family members, at times they're afraid that they're asking for too much and they're worried about the burden on the family. Some Native peoples will be worried about like that in some ways is inappropriate for me because of what the future is asking of me. So again, that's just a small summary, but those 3 points I think are really significant, and particularly how they might show up in your spaces.
Dr. Martinez,
Yeah.
could you share the definition of 7 generations, please? Someone asked in the chat.
Yep. So the 7 generations is the premise that I make a decision, and it's not I individual, it's actually nations. So this is a traditional nation definition, is that decisions that we make for today must account for 7 generations in the future and how that will impact those 7 generations in the future. So that's where, like, you can't just make a decision about today. We have to think about those 7 generations in the future. And typically I try to help people, like, if you think 7 generations, even if we go on short end, you're talking about at least 150 years out. Right? Yeah, I just like to give the numbers to it. And that, again, that's like 20 years per generation. Again, that's the short end, because we probably are waiting to have kids, but it gives you context that this decision must consider that longitudinalness in terms of what it's going to be like at that time. So that's the 7 generations. Again, some people will say that very specifically, but there's others that are definitely thinking about future generations. You'll hear that language, future generations. So there are these particular framings that I want to give you then too. Again, that last slide is really kind of the bodies of, again, the ancestors, the present, and then the futures. This is, I think, pretty key foundational ways in which people are relating to the world. I intentionally picked this image also to be able to demonstrate to you what I see as this very ancestral image, because it's traditional regalia. This would be regalia in terms of some of their outfits, but it's also very contemporary, and it's also very generational. And it's because it's the grandmother and grandchild. I think it's contemporary because of the umbrella. There's the traditional eagle flag. I mean, you can see this kind of representation. The people have reacted to this in terms of like they don't have faces. Actually, that's a tradition in particular tribal situations because of how that can humanize things, and then we have a different responsibility. So it actually is an intentional practice. Besides, I think it's a really cool image. So that's also why I like to share it. But so the 3 kind of primary kind of touchstones in terms of where people might actually relate to is this idea of collective principles. I used to refer to this as like being parts of community, but we got to that language community and it got too sloppy. Like everybody's in the community and everybody, it's really collective principles because it's how you're really seeking to sustain those, right? And sustain literally the collective, sustain literally, this is where you have redistribution. This is where you have egalitarianism and a number of those other things. In those collective principles, there really is this kind of circular knowing. And at times people, I think, linearize that in that they make it flat, like a circle being flat. And it's like, no, you got to like 3-dimensionalize it. Like circular knowing also includes the sky, and it's like seasonal knowing. It literally is even kind of, birth to death knowing. That's the circular kind of consideration. So it's collective, meaning the peoples, and it's not just human beings, but it's kinship. It's even collective principles because of my responsibility to the past and the future. But it's much more about those collective principles in the terms of how we're seeking to show up with a circular process. See, the principle is collective, but the process is circular. And again, make that much more 3-dimensional. That many potentially have heard about the role of natural reason, natural law, but our connection heavily to nature and the environment. And it's much more than, Native peoples are like, I joke at times, like we're the first environmentalists. And again, it's not just me, and I don't know, again, I feel like I want to tag into some people who might remember the America the Beautiful campaign in the 1970s, where they had the crying Indian. We're coming up on Arbor Day. You're going to hear all about Chief Seattle and those. It's very oversimplistic in that. But natural reason literally is nature is our knowers. That's what that means, is who's our knowers. So we always hold natural reason and natural law as heavily sacred, let alone fundamental to our practices, because that's what we learn from. We learn from our kin, the animals, the 4-legged, the winged ones. We actually learn from the star beings. So it isn't just about that relationship to the earth and to the environment and kind of praise or just kind of aesthetic pleasure. It really is because we're dependent upon nature to be better human beings and to learn what it means to be as peoples, because they teach us, right? That's much more about nature, ecosystems, literally how we have, animals that teach us about how to observe, teach us about how to be even respectful. Like all of those things come from nature, which is why nature is such a significant attribute in our communities. And then you'll see this literally, like you have grass dancers, you have ceremonies, you have language, all those things demonstrate the significance of that. So then we're going to have this very geographic grounding in place-based framing. And wisdom sits in places is actually a phrase by Keith Basso, who is an Apache, about this is literally what I'm saying is like natural reason is because wisdom is out there. Wisdom sits in these places, and that's where we learn from. The only thing I'm making reference to is the geographic grounding is that is going to have some variation. Like if you're Apache and you might like have a different relationship like with corn pollen, right? But then if you go to Northeast tribes, they might be using, sage or sweetgrass more. You might, again, so that's the geographic grounding. You might have particular clan systems or animals that are much more reflective of those geographic differences. That's where we want to have these as kind of overarching, but we're always going to be considerate of the fact that a number of things may change, but usually those changes are reflective of the geography. That's the key there. If you have tribes that have different ways of being, often it's heavily attributed to literally the geography that's there. So those would be, like in some ways, 3 pillars and 3 primary framings. Moving on. So then I get into, again, some other examples that I think that you may come across in terms of like how people will present what they know and their ways of knowing. And I feel like people practices, and that's somewhat of like the introduction that Susan read, is that people practice how we know. People practice literally their interpretation of pain as literally an element of how we know, right? And expectations. All of those things come into play. You might get into this in terms of how people have even receiving information in what you say. So this is kind of very much an Indigenous way of exploring knowledge and our knowledge expectations, is that the Muscalera in particular, we believe that like life is a great mystery. It's literally an adage that we hold to. So my knowledge has more freedom to it in terms of me exploring and actually engaging than particularly thinking I'm going to be right and wrong. there's going to be less of that hierarchical and that power over when people are sharing their knowledge. But even in the ways in which we gain that knowledge, and those are the examples below. So we gain knowledge and content. And I may literally listen to the wind and I gain knowledge through that. I don't know, I'll be honest with you, I don't think you'll hear a lot of people say that to you because we know how it often is misinterpreted, right? People are like, what do they mean listen to the wind? Or they somehow diminish it or so forth. So, but do know that that's a process that people will often look at gaining an understanding. Think about that, gaining an understanding literally through processes around you, and particularly ways in which I'm familiar in terms of understanding how I'm being given insights, right? So the process piece was in the plants. That kind of moved the plant idea is that it happens then relationally. It actually happens literally with others. But ultimately in this, that we really are seeking to promote changes in the systems and overall health for people, places, and animals. So it isn't just so much that we want to understand how somebody else is knowing. This is also asking you all, how do you know? How have you come to know what you know? And then how is that used in your spaces? So that's where we're going to promote those changes, which we get into literally cutting appropriation, stereotypes, some of those things, moving into spaces in which we actually understand others. To me, for this highlight is the people, places, and animals, is expanding upon that in terms of how people relate. To then get to better understandings and groundings of cultures, traditions, histories, and futures. And I'm going to give you some examples of that here in a second. But I'm going to move through a couple of these a little faster because of where our time is. So this is certainly this slide, traveling roads already built. This is what I think that you're on and what that you all practice to some extent. But I kept it in this work because I thought it might reveal some things for you. That I think that one of the things that easily we're doing more and more is revealing this situated and subjugated knowledges. And what that means is like, how do people actually, people of color in particular, they talk about their lives and their situations versus me as outsider or helicopter or extractive talk about that. And I do feel like we've done a whole lot more work of trying to get people's situated and subjugated knowledges revealed, having them speak for themselves. We've done surveys, we do storytelling, we do that. So, but I think in your spaces, this potentially can still surface, particularly around issues of brain injury, to be honest with you. I think that that's one of the spaces because there's such this idea of literally how people represent themselves and talk about themselves that gets, altered. So how do we understand who they are and that they can share that? So this idea of situated and subjugated knowledges is literally holding attention to all the ways in which people have voices have been taken away, their experiences have been shifted, the ways in which they've been denied literally an expression of themselves and their situations. So again, Haraway is an author, Harding is an author also. These are feminist philosophers who work on consciousness and subjectivity that specifically locate women as necessary locations of study and value. And I didn't find any statistics on this, and I'll be honest, I didn't get to look at it, but I think that in your work, there is a gender component that often may get minimized. I don't know, but I think that the processes that happen with women in many of these health conditions absolutely is really important for us to understand. So I didn't want to hide the gender element because I think it shows up in plenty of health equities that we know of. So I want to highlight, how do we get to that consciousness and understanding the subjectivity of women that are often so dismissed, their symptoms being dismissed, issues of pain being dismissed. I mean, there's so many things that for women it's dismissed. But we're going to move to then where do we want to go? So these are indigenous theories. But I thought if we truly want to eliminate barriers, we have to understand how indigenous peoples understand themselves. And although these are theories, I can easily demonstrate to you examples of where I'd see these show up, but I'm also trying to be really careful with our time. I always get a little panicked with time, I'll be honest with you, but I think this is where we want to go. And I think that for some of you, whether it's, my guess is that some of you are going to create policy. Some of you actually are going to literally look at distribution of resources, like where money goes in terms of different services. I think that some of you may do your own research in terms of who you're serving and how it is that you're actually seeking to attain that. So this is why I just threw this slide in here in terms of, I think it's important current work on indigenous ways and how we serve indigenous nations and peoples. there is this concept of radical indigenism by Eva Garut, where she says, and certainly the argument of radical isn't that we're like radical in nature, like disruptive, but radical in definition means at root. So at the very root, how do people live indigenism? How do you live it? It comes back to that question in many ways that was posed before, that there is an expectation that you're living indigenism, not just I can track some biological connection. That goes back then to, do we understand how to practice the collective principles? Do you have space where you're literally actually bringing in natural reason? Those all connect to that, but that's a very present thing in indigenous communities. And again, you're going to see it in urban communities. And I would say at a certain level, there's a heightened kind of revival and a return to indigenous practices, even as urban people, because overall that's happening. Again, this return to it, even as indigenous, you're going to see that the call out because of the displacement becomes so much more real. There is a transnational indigeneity that I think is happening because certain borders and boundaries just don't exist in the same way anymore. Some of that literally is because of the internet. There's so much more going on across borders and boundaries. So that transnational understanding of indigenous of even North America is becoming more present than indigenous of Mexico or indigenous of Canada, like First Nations versus Aboriginal versus. This is why you actually see indigenous used so much more than even Native American or other languages, because there's an understanding of issues that are thematic about how we understand how we live the word, but also the issues that we're coming together to address. And the last one is just Southern theories. And I think that this gets back to, if you're developing policies, if you're distributing money, if you're actually looking at how do we better serve, or how do we actually do our work in enhanced ways. So this is Rae Wynn Connell. She's Maori, and her theory literally is called dirty theory. And the premise is that the best way we can ever develop any of these things is that you have to be in the dirt with people in those circumstances and in those situations to fully know how to make change and to actually impact it. This isn't grounded theory. Some people I know that do this is like grounded theory. That's a different thing. Dirty theory literally is, we have to be in the midst of all that. I used to call this like, you have to go in the muck, get into the muck, get dirty with it before we actually are making decisions, right? And again, the decisions for 7 generations. The 7 generations are going to be impacted in your work because what we do with people of this generation affects those generations down the road, whether it's generational trauma, generational wealth, any of those, it always is going to that. But we have to do it from a very grounded presence within the peoples. So there's a couple more things here in terms of culture and practice. And this to me was, how do you address some of these barriers? I'm going to do these really fast, and I want to do a quick check-in in terms of seeing where people are. But so often in these spaces, people are like, how do we do culture? How do we actually do things around addressing BIPOC communities, right? This is the language of today. What do we do for BIPOC? But it's like, how do you understand culture? So there's some of this where what we have to understand is culture is not something people merely practice or preserve, but it really is something in which something within which they properly dwell. So this to me is like, when you're starting to look at how do you do this for specific populations, we can do the kind of tokenism of what I call like body politic, of how people just show up visually. But if we truly want to understand culture, the idea is like, you merely practice maybe again through songs, or you're preserving it through a recipe, right? Something like that. No, culture is really about how I dwell, which is about how I breathe, how I literally, speak, how I connect. I just think it's a pretty significant shift in terms of some of the ways in which people have proposed what culture is. And then to fully develop this kind of radical indigenous, as Groot was saying, is that we actually presuppose that particularly indigenous peoples possess complete philosophies of knowledge and models of inquiry through interactions with land and language. So these are the things that I've talked about. In your places, my sense is there's still so much that's carrying, that even indigenous peoples carry, that somehow we're less than, that we're incompetent, that we don't know enough. So this is going to show up generationally for you, particularly if you're working with some older native populations, that there's hesitancies around what I can say and whether or not I know enough to say. You have some folks that I know, I still have some folks, they were in boarding schools. So this is part of what you're trying to attend here with this quote, is that we do possess those complete philosophies and ways of knowing, but they've often been either beaten literally and are questioned to such a degree that you may have to think about different ways to actually make contact and make connections with those folks. That's what they're talking about here. And to figure out, like, if we're trying to understand somebody, it isn't just simply like, oh, what foods do you like, or what songs you listen to, but how do they live? That's the dwelling part. And I think that's what you're seeking to meet when you're trying to truly provide services that are relatable and successful, right? That's the stuff that you have to go to. And kind of continuing on this thread is that if we concentrate on the connections that tie Indigenous community together rather than the boundaries that separate them, then we can ask other questions about gender, imperialism, class, worldwide circulation of cultures, which we have sustained little attention. Again, we've been this in some ways is that I said, there's over 575 federally recognized nations. You can have threads, those are the ties, but then look at where might be a nation and something specific that people might need from their own spaces. That's what we're getting at, but we have to have that, where I would say that the issue of the ties being detrimental is the stereotypes, is the appropriation. When we then want to look at literally those ties as strength, is there's consistency. My work has spanned, actually, I don't think I even said, so it is international. I've done some stuff with the Maori, Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the Maasai in Kenya, the Sami in the Scandinavian countries. I've done a number of projects domestically, from the Haudenosaunee people to some Inuits to Pueblos, Navajo, Hopi. I mean, Northern Cheyenne, Southern, a bunch. And there's definitely consistencies. Yet we're also not stripping those away from kind of the uniquenesses of them. And again, so these are definitely more quotes, and I'm not trying to like overdo the quote thing, but I also think that they're powerful, because there is this power of social science generalizations that if we multiply and link together the characteristics within it, we can apply them, that we can actually get to the dirty theory. Again, I'm moving through this. It'll be on the recording. I don't like just talking to people. That's what's the hard part about Zoom. But I want to do this slide actually, because I think it's a little bit more poignant. Besides that, I actually think the slide visual is really striking. So culture really is values, beliefs, and practices. And again, that's 101, the first definition. And to understand culture is this sphere of existence in which people make their lives individually and collectively meaningful. I always feel like that should be bolded and like jumping out, because it's the meaningfulness, right? You don't just practice something, you practice it because of the meaningfulness, right? In Indigenous peoples, it's individually, but it's collective, that encompasses both practices through which meaning is generated in material forms, but also that it's embodied. The embodied, again, is how we dwell, right? That's the culture. And for me, the picture of the owl here in some ways was asking you to think about, because nobody really sees pictures of owls walking, right? So there's a point for me is like, just to get us to understand, they do walk, they have feet, they do this, right? And certainly there's a visual expression here of the seriousness, or the one on the left, I kind of feel like is getting ready to break out in a dance or something. I think at times for us to relate to populations, we have to break out of some of the prescribed and expected ways of understanding people. So that's a piece of what I'm highlighting here. I will say often, I actually really try to move away from the language of culture itself, because I think it can get very truncated. This is, the 1970s and celebrations of multiculturalism. This is why you have like Cinco de Mayo Day, or you have, this other like one day that it's often the language we call the 3 Fs, which is food, fun, and festival. That's not culture in the sense that you're seeking to understand, particularly when you're working, again, with populations like Indigenous populations. You have to go to values, beliefs, and practices and how they are embodied. Always go to that next piece. Okay. Yeah, let me just do a couple more. Then I'm gonna take a pause, and then we might actually get into the small group. So we want to see this interplay with the values, beliefs, and practices and how people live in Indigenous ways. Remember, Native peoples definitely have individual identity. So this is one of the things that can come up when we focus so much on particularly the idea of the collective principles. But collective principles doesn't mean that you get erased as individuals. but that I learn my individual identity in relationship and negotiation with the collective, right? And also I'm doing that in face of the external colonizing society. So just pause in a second, because I know I'm dumping a lot on y'all. But this is important, that we're like individual people, they're gonna identify with their tribe, they're gonna identify with their nation's language here. Where we are geographically, you're going to hear both of those words, tribes and nations, because literally the Pueblos have tribes more specifically, but then you have nation territories. If you're on the East Coast, you hear nations, you rarely hear tribes. So it is interchangeable in that they are sovereign entities. It's just language that fits, again, geographies. But you will have this process of collective identity, but that individuals exist as individuals. So I talk about this in my classes, like, we need people with individual identity because we have individual strengths and skills in which serve the collective. But I'm going to look at how I'm going to accentuate those strengths and skills literally in line to what the collective is also seeking. We're very, very cognizant of that external colonizing society. There's so many things going on right now that are clearly indicators of that too, whether it's food sovereignty movements, climate justice movements, language revitalization programs. There's tons of things going on in that space. Again, to get back to what Deloria told us way back in 1988, is that this world is full of 1998, a playful cultural hybridity and a social world of struggle, hatred, winners, and losers. And it's all being negotiated by Native peoples. And I can illustrate to you, like, the winners and losers, whether it's like Long Ranger and Tonto or Avatar, because it's the same scripts and all these things. So we're always part of that mechanism in which we're actually negotiating those spaces. Okay, so again, I'm going to move past this because it's like, I think I'm getting heavy on the Indigenous beliefs and consciousness. I want to move to this one, in part because of the visual. This is actually a mural that's up in Minnesota. So even if you want to see it in a larger scale, it's actually on the side of a building that's probably 4 stories. The building itself might be 8 stories, and that takes up easily over half of it. If you Google Minnesota Jingle Dancer, because that's what it's named, mural, it'll come up and you can actually see the building image too. So again, trying to give you a visual, like, this is how Native peoples are representing themselves. This is actually a group that did this collectively. It's traditional ancestrally in terms of the jingle dancer. It's contemporary though, in some ways, because of the scarf and the hat. But you can also see the vibrancy, right? This color of vibrancy. It's very much about the jingle dancer as a woman who takes space, in which we've been eliminated so much in spaces as Native women. So that's why I wanted to move to this particular slide, and that we really argue that this consciousness expands and adds to oppositional ideologies, that we were like the winners and losers. Some of the things in which I mentioned before really, understands that we existed prior to dominant ideologies. I often talk about this as pre-colonial, as Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples understand themselves as pre-colonial. All right, so that's just, literally, it's about an hour. I still have a number of slides, but I'm going to jump to a couple of these because I think that they're more about stereotypes, and then we're going to break into the small groups, and I can come back to a couple of the ones in here if necessary. I want to jump to this one. I do a lot of methods. I think that these questions can serve you all in terms of what you do in your work. So when I was thinking about this and like, what do you do when you're in this space? I still think it's valuable to come back to these questions of why do you care and what does it matter? This would be very Indigenous framework, that asks us again, why do we care? What does it matter? Right? So it literally asks, how do we show up? What do we give resources to? This is heavily if you're doing research and you're trying to change things. Am I asking the question that literally our patients and our clients are really seeking, or is it something that's going to advance a particular thing of my interest? I think when you first start to design, whether again, it's even a client protocol or again, patient protocol language there, or you're looking at how do we actually market anything, like asking these questions first can move you away from some of the colonial framing that actually is embedded literally in health delivery and healthcare. So I start with those questions. And again, as researchers, it's our interest to maximize the wealth of materials. We want to get bigger. We want to get more. And this is contrary, very traditional Western is like you're slimming down and you're slimming down. Indigenous peoples are always looking at multiplying. We want to multiply rather than slim down, because that then increases literally the ways in which local sources of thinking can actually then also surface. You're going to have different things pop up. If you have somebody who's like in Denver, or if you have somebody, I don't know, who's Grand Junction, yeah, those things are going to show up. So you're looking at multiplying, but I always start with these two questions, which is, why do I care? What does it matter? Because it tells me why I'm going into some spaces. And then the other two that I ask that I put up here for y'all too is like, I think that we need to be really careful when we're hearing people, right? And literally asking ourselves, what truth do I want to hear? And then thinking about, based upon what I capture from what somebody else is saying, what's the reality that I'll be creating when I actually disseminate the information? We go in with particular expectations, right? What truth do you want to hear? And you might feel like, I'm not expecting them to lie, but are we checking that we have a script that's already located? And are we actually considering, is that true? Is that really what actually we're hoping to come out of that space? But what truth do we want to hear? And it can be much more tricky, right? Because you're in a situation in which you're trying to potentially attend to somebody who again is hurt. But how are we going into that space? And if I conclude certain things, what's the reality that I've created about that person and or that situation? I think it just holds us to a different kind of ethic. And in that, so this idea that so much of this work is also breaking kind of Western expectations and moving over to moving past these borders and blurring the boundaries. You want to challenge the power relationships. And I was thinking about this a bit more with the types of engagements and situations that y'all are going to be in. But are there ways in which you can dismiss some of that power that's there? In which sometimes it's difficult when you're really beholden to insurance, right? Or you're beholden to other like hospital expectations. So where can we challenge that power relationship between heavily the knowing and knowers? If there's children that you're dealing with, is there a way in which we can shift how we understand what they're offering, even if they're children? That power relationship can definitely distort so much in terms of how we understand what we're seeking to do. Which in that, we reframe who's the expert. Am I the expert as somebody who is the practitioner, or is this person the expert because literally they're the ones who live in the situation, right? And then what do we do with the weight of that information that's provided to you? You always want to look at co-producing materials, because that can help us literally use the appropriate language, images, and it's appropriate more in that it makes connections. I'm not necessarily looking at appropriate in terms of like, is it right or wrong? I don't want that binary. I want appropriate materials because it literally serves and makes the connections. Like it makes sense, right? And then we co-constitute in terms of very respectful ethics. We're always looking at giving back. And again, the recording is available to you, and the slides will too be also available to you. But let's move on to a couple more before we do our little break. So this is like the methods, and it was one of those where I wasn't sure, like, because some people think it's just methodological, but I actually wanted to keep this one because I feel like this picture is very poignant too. Like, which side do you want to where do you want to line up when we're doing this work? In many ways, y'all are in this space of doing advocacy and doing kind of, that kind of work. So, are we going to be? This is a real troop in France that's very active at all kinds of protests, where they literally dress up as clowns and show up at all kinds of protests and don't say anything. They don't vocalize. They just show up and have presence. And to me, one of the things that happens in having that presence is that, what are you representing? In this image, to me, that they represent a breakage from the status quo, right? That's the thing you're seeking to break, that representation of the status quo. We can locate in academic discourses. I think in your work, locate in the patient work, locate that discourse appropriately, that it has significance, and it can make the change and the weight that you're trying to actually do. But we're always looking at assisting, whether it's readers or scholars, family members, other people, how they're part of that process. That's some of the shift, right? And again, I think that you all might know some of this. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but definitely the overall is that you're seeking to honor voices, because this is part of what happens when we miss that stuff. When we miss those things, we fail to actually hear people. We fail to hear the voices, and we potentially can appropriate and commodify instead. So we want to reject that assumption that those in positions who are granting them the authority to interpret our reality are really entitled to do so, right? I think this shows up. My guess, again, I'm sorry to laugh because I don't want to be it's not funny, right? But I think that you're in systems in which there's a lot of authority over what you do. So are those people, and this is Patricia Hill Collins and actually Chelsea Sandoval. So they're actually talking heavily about women of color, but this is also certainly something that happens with Indigenous peoples, which is why I have the cartoon there with Kemosabe and the Long Ranger, is because literally for the longest time, the Long Ranger is seen as this position of authority, right? And that he was the knower and that he was the leader, he was the savior, right? And Tonto literally was just the sidekick. So the cartoon really kind of flips that, right? Because Tonto was the one who was all knowing, and that, the Lone Ranger, long since retired, finally makes this unpleasant discovery and realizes that, Kemosabe, which is what Tonto always said to him, was an Apache expression for horse's rear end. Come on, it's funny, right? Somebody asked me though, it's like, it's true. I'm like, I don't know, Kemosabe, I don't, so because it's Apache, but literally that cartoon is giving you the juxtaposition there. Who's the authority and what do they really know? You're going to have federal policies, you have state policies, all of those kind of things you're going to have to negotiate. So this is a real one for you all, I think, in your spaces. Because what we need to get to, again, is capture meaning and essence. We need the power of our modern critical thinking, the modern, where are you all stepping into these spaces in order to deny the meanings, not in order to deny meanings and bodies, but in order to live in meaning and bodies. I think this really speaks a lot to some of the things in what you're going to do, because so much of what you're all going to be dealing with is people's bodies, right? We don't want to deny those conditions. We're actually trying to seek to understand those conditions and how we can attend to that. So again, because of hearing voices, we're going to disrupt some of these stereotypes. And some of the stereotypes, right? And there is this idea that so many others have articulated this. We're disrupting these stereotypes and biases. I'm going to get to this slide because I think it's the easy visual, right? Here are the stereotypical harms where you have Native women particularly are applied to, the princess, which is there, the image. This is Pocahontas, right? Right. So the two paradoxical stereotypes to Native women are based on women's relationship heavily to white men. So it's, the princess who saves the white man, right? That's John Smith and Pocahontas. That's your picture. Or a squaw who becomes the white man's sexual partner. Actually, Pocahontas did that also. That's her. That's the image. Pocahontas is the epitome. Sorry, it's Friday afternoon. Both these stereotypes. That's the image we get. This is still the image. This is the recent Disney picture. This is the recent Disney picture in terms of this, right? So then we're going to go to this picture though, because this is where we're going. This is literally a recent picture of Indigenous women. This is out near Monument Valley. You can see it's recent. They're all wearing masks. It's COVID. This is what it means to be a Native woman. And this is what we're seeking to actually open up and actually provide space for. How people are, again, they're very traditional. This is a regalia. They're actually wearing jingled dresses also. But the poignancy of the visual of where they stand even, and standing in arms raised as powerful women is very, very important. So we blur these boundaries and cross these borders because we really are seeking to facilitate this humility, generosity, and respect. These are actually attributes in which you would hear a number of Native people say are really important to them. That there's humility even of them standing here in this space, and the generosity in which they're giving, because this project is actually serving their collective through respectful ways. But you can see it's just so striking just to go from the Pocahontas image to this one. This is Native peoples today. This is Native women today. So I'm going to stop there because we're about time in which I was looking at getting y'all to the breakout rooms, because I also we were looking at doing the breakout rooms. There was for about 15 minutes, and I think we're at like 25 people. So we're going to try to have like 4 to 5 in a group. So that's like maybe 6 groups, maybe 5 exactly, maybe, yeah. I think Jamie or Susan was going to set those up. Let me just pause a second. Jamie or Susan, will they just select breakout room, or are you going to put them in one?
I'm just going to put them in one. I think it'll just randomly assign.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Okay, so what we wanted to do in the breakout groups is literally have me stop talking at y'all, but then to see where are you, where are your questions, what might be resonating, what do you feel like you still are missing? Like you sat here for an hour and 15 minutes and is like, all right, it was okay, but where else can we go? with the time that we have. So we're gonna do 15 minutes in the breakout room. Put stuff on the Google Doc, particularly questions that you're still seeking answers to. And then we're gonna come back, get some reporting, and then I will, again, I have pretty significant wealth of information that I possibly can answer other things that are coming up. And then I only have like 3 or 4 slides that I'm looking at wrapping up in terms of what we're doing for today. So unless anybody has a question right now, we're gonna move you all to breakout rooms.
I'll do that.
So be prepared to be bounced to breakout room.
I guess I thought I would also go to a breakout room, but I
Yeah, you totally can.
I don't know how to do that. Okay, I think I can just join one.
I can't help you. I have no idea.
If you want me to watch the time too and then close it in 15 minutes? Is that
Yeah, because that'll get us back here around 2:35. Have people, share for like maybe 10 minutes and give me the last 10, 15 minutes to wrap up.
okay? Great. I will do that.
Do you think at all if people are looking for more specifics about how you actually treat patients or clients?
It's funny you should ask that because I was thinking about this. This feels very much more like one of my graduate school classes. And it's more about like kind of, I'm actually trying to go backwards. And normally when I come into a training, I'm like, okay, so what do I do? And
Yep.
this is actually, I'm trying to resist the urge of what is my role in this. So it's pretty reflective for myself. And I'll be honest, I really was the one driving of like, we need this training because we need to know how to engage Indigenous populations more in Colorado. So, and I tend to do that. I tend to be like, okay, so what are my 3 steps? And so this feels more like broad concepts. And first of all, like, I know this is not what you're saying, but slow your roll. Stop making it about you. And that's the conversation I'm having internally of like slowing down, learning, and not making it so action oriented. So I don't know that that's necessarily where everyone else is. I'm just sort of like spitballing about where I am. And that might, to me, I think that there's a lot of benefit in that. I'm like I said, I'm resisting the urge of like, so what do I do?
Yeah, I got that too. And that's when I was talking to Susan. I don't know. Does George need to get put into a breakout room?
Are you not in a room?
I was put in room 1 and then my internet connection sort of went off and back on. And when I rejoined, I was here.
Let me see how I move you. Move to room.
I'm not, can you re-add me or do I just hang out for now?
Add you to a new room. Are you okay with that? It won't.
So then I'll just be by myself.
I'll
just use the
to like room 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's not giving me the option to, because it shows that
weird. Yeah, either way is fine. I was talking about the 7 generations and I was like in the middle of a sentence and then boom.
Okay.
Thank you. Whatever works.
Okay. Sorry, I am not super savvy with breakout rooms.
No, I definitely understand what you're saying. And I have some things to like bring that back in. I think that there is this danger, right, of the recipe, right? This is what you do, right? And I think that for me, when I was looking at, there is a certain grad school kind of thing, and it was trying to avoid that, but at the same point, I think it's so important because to get the base foundations to move to literally some of even your questions, it's going to be so difficult to contend to issues around the barriers unless you really understand where people are coming from. Because they're not going to say it in that way. People know how to live. They don't always know how to tell you how they're living, right? In these kind of, and particularly more like ancestral ways or, philosophical ways, so I get what you're saying. But I also wanted to check because I felt like it's hard because you never know the audience, but at the same time, you don't want to skip some of the things that I think people often skip, and this is why they don't get it.
Mhm. I really am appreciating your approach because I think, I think we also fall, we can be really susceptible to that like quick jump on a trend. And so
Mhm.
it's like, okay, should we have an land acknowledgement? Should we do these things?
Yeah.
Like, this is what, so we need to just like quickly learn how to participate in this and atone for sins and all of these things without necessarily really understanding the picture. So I really sort of appreciate the concept of like just slow down, understand a culture, and stop trying to be like like that colonial thing you're talking about, coming in and fixing and rescuing. And for us, obviously, the thing that was really shocking was the CDC like saying that above all other populations, Indigenous populations are more likely to die of a brain injury.
Yeah.
And so we're like, okay, God, we got to get in there. We got to do something about this. And so that's an example of us sort of like rushing to, we want to do something. And like, what is that recipe? Like you're saying, what is the recipe to participate? So in some ways, I feel like this gives permission to slow down and understand.
Actually, that's helpful just to remind me how to use this. I mean, some of the again, I think that's the article that I had sent Susan, and I sent another one. And there's another one that just came out recently too. So some of it is literally like are people being assessed appropriately initially and getting care and getting into contact. I haven't dug into that research itself, but we also know that that's true. Around COVID like showed it, right? We were the most vulnerable populations, got hit really, really hard. And some of that literally was just nobody had the right resources. Nobody, I mean, and you have horror stories where like somebody was, I don't know if it was a CDC or something, that they were looking for test kits or PPEs?
Mm-hmm.
They got sent body bags. Yeah, one of the tribes put an order in for PPEs and they got sent body bags instead.
Like we can buy things to prevent you from dying.
Yeah, it is like the most bizarre freaking thing. But yeah, they got sent body bags. And also they ended up using the body bags and they made them into the ribbon shirts, which are these traditional tribes, which was fucking awesome. But like, yeah, I mean, there's such a disconnect though, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, it seems like the most asinine kind of mix up, but at the same time, like, holy shit. But there's a lot of, addiction issues. That's where, when I was initially talking to Susan, I was like, is that where people want to go? And she didn't feel like that, which is also where we sent out, like, what questions do you have? And these were the questions that people have. But I also wanted to make sure that there's time at the end, like I can flush some of these things out, but I think that there's things in which I offer, like, part of where Native peoples might be literally having higher rates of death around brain injury is like people don't want to talk to us. Again, making assumptions that I'm going to tell you certain things. This is the problem at some levels, that you may ask me, but I still may not answer, right? In the way that you're thinking. I may answer, you're just not picking it up. Yeah. Because you're looking for it to come back in a particular way. So again, we can talk about some of that. And that's where, though, if you can make some relationship and connection based upon what like that you have a sense like there's that ancestry is really important, or that the future generations are really important, you can potentially start to maybe find ways to make those connections better. Mm-hmm. People are going to be, I think a lot of people are going to be very quiet. They're not going to say near as much. It's just not part of our makeup, because some of it is not even knowing like how to describe things. Like the colonial impact is so hard. So that's where knowing some of if this is where people come from, maybe you can start to break some of that, let alone like actually letting somebody, burn sage in a room, which can get to be over simplistic, but if you're asking somebody about their pain, is there a way you can ask that they can relate to without it seeming an individual thing? Yeah. I don't know, like if you use, it reminds me of like, you know, when some of the brain injury things, like you use visual cue cards and that kind of stuff, like, and like what they're seeing and how they're processing. I would be looking at changing a whole bunch of that shit in terms of like making it more relevant to like, you know, our ways of being.
Yeah. Well, you had on one of your slides, and I'm really grateful that you're willing to share those with us. Like, I can't remember the word, but when you're collaborating with you know, an individual in that culture, in that population, to develop materials. And we have a member on our board who he's on the call as well, with the Denver Indian Center, and we're wanting to foster that relationship too, to like, how can we, it's not a like for like, when we would normally come into any given, you know, population, whether individuals that are experiencing some sort of vulnerability, we would be like, okay, so this is where you're going to train on brain injury, we're going to do this stuff. And when we've had these conversations with them, they're like, that's not going to work here. We're like, so what we've talked about is like, how can we come in and then look at the material we have, and then you teach us how to make this work for your population, and maybe you deliver it or you roll out this, you know,
Or you do it in collaboration. I've seen those stuff that happen a lot. I actually think that that could be a great next step. Like, I really do think that this is necessary, or else you just change materials, but we don't necessarily change the tone and or the ability to make impact, right? So I feel like this is the first step. And then I would be looking at the next step is then what are the much more applied pieces? And maybe it is that you have some people who hopefully in the small groups can know, like, where do we take this? And then how do we adjust and modify it? Like I was saying early on, do that instead of doing landing knowledge statement. Like, you know, people are going to be so much more responsive to, wow, they got us and they're doing this. Then I need a statement that you understand that you stole our land historically.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Cat wanted to out. Yeah, we'll see. And that's where it would be like if you have materials, I'd be so, again, I feel like somebody might need to dig into the CDC. I don't know what's the point that's being missed in terms of the higher rates of death. Is it lack of diagnosis? Is it literally failure of appropriate treatment? Is it literally that the clients aren't following treatment protocols? You know what I mean? Like, you have to break that down. And then that can give much better insight into then how do we adjust that?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's like I don't know if there's near as many comorbidity. It also would be so striking as to whether or not there's any data that really says why there's higher rates. I don't even know if it's higher outright. But what are the conditions in which the brain injuries are occurring?
Yeah. I think it's, you know, a lot of the same health inequities sort of apply to brain injury, and you know, just not having the access to the proper follow-up. I don't know that prevalence is higher of brain injury within the population, but outcomes are poorer. So
is that split between urban and nation territory?
I don't think it's that detailed, at least not what I.
Because that would be a big difference, particularly in access to follow-up. Although, you know, you have more IHS though, it's just so underfunded.
We do have, you know, this isn't quite the same thing, but individuals in, like, we know that TBI and individuals in rural areas typically have poor outcomes anyway, right?
Yep.
I mean, less access to services. I'm going to drop this in the chat so you could see.
Are people coming back soon? How much time do we have?
Yeah, do you want to give them, we said 2:35, so like 4 more minutes?
Yeah, let me run to the bathroom. All right.
right, I will, I think if I close the room, it'll give them a minute. Does it now feel good?
Can you see if is anybody doing anything on the Google Doc?
I have so many tabs open. I have a real tab problem since we've been virtual. Yes, they have been. Looks like
Cool.
some questions. Question for Jamie. Uh-oh. Yikes. Okay. Should I bring everyone back?
Yep. Can you see the screen again, my share?
Yes. Well, I can see your full desktop.
Okay.
It looks like most people are back. It should have just automatically pulled everybody back in, right?
Looks like everyone's in.
Okay. Back. Okay, so I'm going to start again. I'm going to I want to start off with acknowledging that the first part might seem to be more theory or conceptual, or even Jamie and I were talking a little bit. That's felt a little bit back in grad school. Well, there's a little bit of that. I actually, though, decided to do some of that intro and part some of the earlier conversations around what people might need. Here's the other reason why. I think that you can take this information, if absent of the information I gave you in the forefront, y'all can look at like, how do we better serve Native populations? And it can end up being, again, another like maybe grad school word, but very like neoliberal. You just end up changing things and not really doing the fundamental changes. So we repeat the colonialism because we really haven't attended to the fundamental foundational changes that are necessary, which is really understanding people from the places in which they come from. So I understand that that might have felt too high, pie in the sky, but I would heavily encourage you to consider those things as you move forward on anything in which you then seek to apply. And Jamie and I were talking about like even understanding like the CDC numbers and some of those things around like the high rates of death for Indigenous populations that have brain injuries, which also is like, this is the stuff that we were dealing with COVID. We had the highest rates of deaths that were going on with that. Yet, this is also the thing that I think is striking, particularly with COVID, as that by far nations were like the first ones to get vaccinated. Because as soon as it was accessible, everybody was doing it, which shows you, I think, an indication of what does it mean when you live in collective societies. And that we have information from nations who had extra vaccines and they started like giving them to the teachers before it was accessible to the people. So that's out there. We know that that's out there. I want us to avoid taking a step in the direction in which we really need, which is serving people in the ways in which it makes sense, but avoid just repeating some of the same errors just that we changed the way it got dressed or the way it looked. And it could maybe really ask us to do some fundamental shifts in terms of maybe even how you initially do an assessment, right? Because there's a number of things that I could consider about, like, how do I meet people where they are, right? How do I do that dirty theory, like get in the dirt, be there with them, that I could even start to think about that assessment. So I know, like, even with the CDC, I don't know if some of the deaths are attributed to, like, is it the lack of proper diagnosis? Failure treatment? Is it, if it is like they're on nation territory, that's sometimes the IHS stuff. We're just profoundly under resourced. But if you have high rates of brain injury, death related to brain injury, urban, then it's different questions. So that's always with the data thing. We got to understand that a little bit more. And I'm actually a big proponent of data. But we have to understand some of those fundamental things in the beginning. Think about, and you have this, like, what language would you use? And are you going to think about language that you might put on a brochure that people will be like, well, I'm not going there because they just piss me off. Like, you could, I'm sorry, but you could literally see somebody think that this is like this cool marketing campaign. We talk about somebody's tribe. It's like, you don't even understand, like, that's highly offensive. So as soon as you think you're connecting to particular spaces, you're foregoing literally where people are coming from. If we have a certain kind of understanding of the role of natural reason, where could that be integrated into, even when you're looking at a treatment plan? And is there a metaphor? Like, metaphors are huge in Indigenous communities. And is there a metaphor that you could even start to consider in terms of implementing and integrating into spaces? So I'm just acknowledging that, and we have time. We're going to open it up in a second in terms of where people are from the breakouts, and particularly if there's other questions. But I have this slide up right now where I feel like this is a critical claim, and that this is me arguing, which I really actually don't like to argue a lot. But my claim is that, people really shape our understanding of their stories in as much as we shape the presentation of their stories. And even in your work, it's like people really shape an understanding of their stories as much as you comprehend, right? And then share that story, right? And I think that we forgo that at times, like whether it's like particular language that they use, tone that they use, even nonverbals, gutturals, there's all kinds of things. And I use this picture, and it's hard to see, but I don't know if anybody can tell what's the animal that's hanging upside down there. Can anybody see enough? Can you tell me what that animal is?
Is it a bison?
It's not a bison. Close though.
Elephant?
It's a rhino.
Oh,
Okay. So y'all are really close. And here's the thing. This is actually, they figured out that it's safer and better to transport. And this is because rhino is an endangered species and they're being poached and killed, right? So they were moving this rhino to a different preserve. They actually figured out it was the safest and healthiest thing is to move it upside down. So I use this picture specifically because I think we have to rethink at times what we might think is healthy and safe. Because it's like, what the hell is it doing upside down? But no, it literally was the healthiest, safest thing. And heavily they figured that out by trying to pay attention to literally the rhino, its anatomical structure, because it's this whole weight pressure thing, right, on its lungs and its heart. It's like, oh, because they stopped for a second to rethink literally, what does it mean to be a rhino, right? And how can we do this? So I think about that as a way that, again, how do we understand what's being presented to us, and that what we're going to do with that story, what we're going to do with that information. So that's where I wanted to be on that slide. I'm going to do two last ones here, and then we're going to see where you are with breakout rooms and questions. So again, I think decolonizing language is a simple one. You want to avoid the constructed history. Here's one of the things in this space, like really avoid the victimhood survivorship kind of language. Even with like native peoples, is like, oh, like, your people survived. And like, even though when like the Keystone Pipeline was going on, people were like, haven't they suffered enough? Come on, that's not our history. Our history is much richer than that. So that's that, and avoid that language. Really think about if you ever use the word traditional, and even traditional Western. I start using Western, like in your spaces, I would even potentially talk about like, this is Western practice, just so people know, and that you have a chance then to move to different things. But we often use traditional and think that, and in this space, it's Western, but not native traditional, because traditional is such an important word in native communities. You really have to be careful of that kind of language. All my relations is just one of those things that I think is out there that you can start to think about, because that would be a way in which Native peoples reflect kinship, right? And then when you write these findings, you speak these truths, really think about how you present data. I know I did a buffalo restoration project in the community, and we ended up doing literally a word cloud based upon a bunch of different interviews that we had done. And then the tribe asked us to do the word cloud in the shape of a buffalo. It was freaking awesome. Like, you know, so it's a small thing, but see how like it makes that connection and it makes that relationship literally to the population. So I'd be looking at, how do I make those connections and those relationships? For Native peoples, that continuity of the past to the present, we kind of talked about that in the futures, always understand plurals collective. All right, I want to just do this one and mainly focus on this, and then I'm going to open it up. Focus on literally, this is, I don't know if it's a meme as much as it's just some chat, and I thought it was pretty striking in terms of understanding that, you know, that there are Ethiopian baboons that are starting to domesticate wolves, which is giving scientists new insights about what it might have been like when early humans did that. And the person's like, that's pretty cool. But then the other person's like, not quite as cool as we thought, screams a scientist, as baboons riding wolves come pouring out of the forest. I just think it's really funny. But it also shows you, literally, you think we're doing something that's right and good because we have forgot to think about the future, right? So we think this is cool and this is right, and it's like, oh, wow, this is fantastic insights, because we disassociated and forgot the futures. So that's what the emphasis there is, that we got to think about the futures and think about, like, this might seem that it fits right now, but what's context and complications. All right, so then this is the very last one that I thought was poignant in terms of, again, with Indigenous peoples, there's a lot of like, stop thinking that y'all are the bosses of me, particularly because of this colonial experience that has been so profound. And this is the buffalo, and the project is buffalo. It's ironic in this as an example. I literally was part of another group of academics in which they asked us to talk about a project we just done, and I said, I was doing this buffalo restoration project. I literally had this other professor say, well, technically it's bison, and I'm like, you got to be kidding. I'm like, I think he said in Western science it's bison, and I said, well, Indigenous science is buffalo. You can see, like, so it's a good example of that tension, right? Like, how do I need to tell you what, and how will you hear it? So that's the image. The quote there is, our lives need more sentences, is actually a quote from Sheila Watt Coulter, who is an Aleut person, who literally is like, just don't put us in footnotes of things, you know, understand this much more fully. So those are my slides. We still have almost 15 minutes. Would love to hear what else is going on in your small groups, questions you need, things in which you want to share from those conversations. So I'm going to open it up.
There's a number of things that got added into the Google Doc too, so we can go through those if we'd like.
Yeah, I'm going to stop share. You can see more people, and I can actually pull up the doc then too, I think. Is there any that you want to start us with, Susan, or somebody?
Well, there's, what can we do that aren't empty gestures? That's a pretty broad. Explain Indigenous distrust of the medical system and medical care.
Okay, let me jump on those. And then we saw like 13, 14 minutes. First one, empty. I mean, at some level, empty gestures. You know, put them. Is it rude? Put your money where your mouth is, kind of thing. Back it up. You know, where are the resources? Empty gestures. Are you actually making infrastructure changes, system changes? Are you really increasing accessibility? You know, the empty gestures are the aesthetic things. This is where, again, skip necessarily money if it's limited to do a land acknowledgement and put it someplace else. You know, are you delivering programs to people, or are you making everybody come to you? That's one. I know, you know, like even with the Denver Indian Center, is like, how do you help people get there when there's events? How do we actually support them, because they're serving so many people, and so many, like, there's a lot of different ways in which you can move past the empty gestures. We have to be really, really careful of the empty gestures and the aesthetic kind of things that keep getting pushed. Are you doing anything that might be helping create Indigenous doctors and practitioners? Have you done anything, with the Brain Injury Alliance to connect with an Indigenous doctor or practitioner? Again, I know you probably all have different maybe degrees, especially, but where are you doing that? Like bringing people in that actually are practitioners and not just kind of the side people or admin or people in your marketing materials. So that, I mean, those are some big places. Doing scholarships for people to get that degree to become part of the alliance, right? Those kind of things. Is there a particular alliance? It's Colorado. Is there a specific alliance with the Ute Nation? Like, like those kind of things are some of the things that I would start to think about that aren't the empty gestures. The distrust of the medical society, geez, I mean, it's profound, it's long. I mean, there's tons of examples. The forced sterilization, measles, smallpox. I mean, that's the distrust. That's the systematic stuff, let alone the distrust if I go for service and I don't get service, I don't get help. And so much of like the stuff I did on the forefront is why we're not getting help that's meaningful to us, because you're doing it in a way and are offering things that doesn't have correlation and relevancy to me. Even to the point where like it's a distrust if literally all I do is feel like all you want to do is help me, and you're forgetting that my responsibilities to my family and my kin are being negated in that. I think it's in some, it's a lot of the classic, vulnerable populations distrust. People don't listen. And you got to realize, even though you might think that you're giving this person even an hour of time, if you're not really hearing what they're talking about, it comes across as that you're not listening, right? Those are the things where, are you making an effort to really relate and connect, which is why I did some of that work much more in that first hour, kind of understand people from those places, so I think that's distrust. I think that it's the failures easily. It's the failures, let alone very specific things that have happened. So again, forced sterilization, it still was going. I think we have some cases from the 1980s. Now it's happening. It's not called forced sterilization, but we're also having it again, where it's like in the best interest of the patient. And again, without consent. You have things that have happened in the field where like people have done literally research and experiments. Probably the Havasupai case is the one that's more recently, where you had people take blood samples that were supposed to be used to help around a diabetes program, and they were used to try to prove the Bering Strait theory. There's plenty of it. It's all of those big things, but I think the distrust on a personal level is that you're failing to meet people where they are,
Thank you. One person wrote, I have never heard of 7 generations. Could we hear more about that? It's the idea that whatever actions you take, you should consider the impact of it on the next 7 generations. Mm-hmm. If there's any more that you would want to say about that. I know we did talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing, and this is one that I was gonna say you could Google it, but you're gonna get that company 7 Generations that comes up that sells like household products, which is, you talk about appropriation. All right. I think it's worth talking about, because I also think that it's heavier right now, because we got war right now. That's people might think it's across the globe, but this is here. We got climate catastrophe all over the place. So I even want to call it that, because it's not climate justice. We have all kinds of conflicts within our, even domestic borders, with like the pipeline, with sovereignty issues. There's a case right now going in front of the Supreme Court around ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and whether or not that's going to be upheld or actually dismantled. We just had the act that actually gives resources for sexual assault and violence to women, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, which there's a provision specifically that gives money to Indigenous populations that if it gets withdrawn, we're sorry language, but we're screwed again. I'm mentioning all of those things because that's the 7th generation. It's like, how are we making decisions today? If we're foregoing literally land, and not just land, but our environment, where you're going to put a pipeline through, it literally, the Keystone Pipeline, even after all the resistance, it was hooked up and it leaked oil within the first 2 weeks. Over 200,000 gallons of oil were leaked. You know, Oak Flats, which is just down here, like got sold off to an Australian company to do mining, and it literally is sacred grounds. That affects 7 generations. And I know that that's not Native people making those generations, but it's the country, which is us. We can't forego that when we think it's just this political entity. It's like, who do we have as representatives, right? It's 7 generations with, you know, Colorado has done some things. We got the mascots got outlawed. Any youth that's a member of the 48 tribes that are recognized in Colorado now can get in-state tuition. There's some of us that are just starting to look at trying to pass a bill to have Indigenous studies actually taught in K through 12 systems, which actually Washington State and Wyoming have done. Those impact 7 generations. So that's what we're talking about, that idea that literally what happens in 100, 150 years because of the decisions that we're making today.
Thank you. Wouldn't someone with a brain injury, no matter their background, wouldn't the needs still be the same in terms of resources?
My yes and no. Like, do you want to look at that just like in this physiological way? Body movement or something? I don't know, maybe, but you all know this too at some level, right? Is like, but how do you deliver that? And how is it that you actually, it makes sense to somebody? And, you know, and I would say that there's some physiological differences. We actually do know that. We've kind of, we did this kind of backlash where like everybody bleeds red. And there was this definite backlash. Actually, we know physiologically around some of these things that are different. So I don't know, brain chemistry could be one of those things. It actually reminds me of a talk that an Indigenous person did on the neuropsychology of Indigenous brains. And there you can see different, they did this with brain scans, CAT scans, and the different things that came up on Indigenous brains, particularly around music and dance. It shows up super strong in terms of literally potential successful treatment options around different things. I can look for that link and send it to Susan and Jamie, and then they can send it out. That's also the historical trauma. More and more epigenetics absolutely is showing that it is different physiologically. You know, physiologically, you carry poverty, you know, of your great grandparents. Epigenetics first got some traction because they were doing this thing as like, well, if you have a fear of spiders, you can blame your grandmother, because the idea is that the fear and flight syndrome got passed on to you genetically. So maybe I talked myself out of the yes thing. I think it's different. I really do. And I think that's where we can excel, right? Is let's meet people from those different considerations, whether again, be values, beliefs, and practices, AKA culture, or we're meeting people literally because of some of these other things. It's going to show up. Generational trauma shows up, stress, anxiety. That's going to show up, brain injury. Absolutely. So in some ways, I guess I changed my answer. I think, yeah, it absolutely has an impact. Absolutely does. But you all are practitioners. What does anybody else want to add into that one or answer that?
I would argue that, you know, being a person-centered organization, everybody's needs can vary, you know, one to the next. So, you know, regardless of background, I would say that it's I think it's important to assume that everyone is whatever their need in particular is could look very different than the next person. I know that we're really short on time,
Yeah.
and so I've really valued this presentation. So I don't want to like totally pivot if other people wanted to comment on the last question, but I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to pick your brain about other ways that we can continue to grow and learn about this particular subject. If you have like suggested media that you would direct us to, or, you know, yeah, what sort of like a good step just in learning?
Justin, I mean, I actually, one of the biggest steps I think is that I think it's tremendously helpful to understand more foundationally and fundamentally how people live. And I mean, even like, what does it mean to have kids if you have a brain injury, right? And I know that people are like moms and dads, but it shows up differently. And I want to be conscious of that. And I actually would say it shows up distinctively. I really don't like using the word different because that normalizes something in which that's part of the problem, right? I mean, I can look for other specific resources. Part of Jamie, I would want to know, like, I think that's really important. But if you're looking at like modalities and particular kind of modalities, there's all kinds of things that are being used more. Again, even that neuropsychology one, in some ways, they're looking at literally movement as being much more significant. Like, and not just like get up and move, but movement that's associated literally to dance, or movement that's also sensory. So you might be burning certain things at the same time as you're doing that because of the sensory thing that happens just generally with people. But you could do particular things like with Indigenous peoples, but you'd also have to find that out with particular individuals, because it may not connect, or it could feel offensive. Literally, it's like, what's this person doing burning this? Like, who the hell are they, right? Because it also, for Native peoples, that's responsibility, and the right person's supposed to be doing that, right? Because if you have somebody do that and they don't know how to be responsible for it, it could bring harm. That's the belief, right? So there's different modalities, absolutely, in that, but it's also like, how are you tapping in brain injury? There's, all know this at some level, music is huge, in terms of how you're actually reprogramming, but I would be looking at that. So might it be that when you're starting to talk about some of those modalities, are we at least starting to name those more specifically? But maybe not just even saying music, but saying like, is there some flute music, which is very stereotypical in some ways. I can't believe I just said that shit. But do you want us to put on Tribe Called Red? That would be the one I'd want y'all to put on for me. Seriously, like get some like, Powell Highway in there for me, and I'd be pretty happy about that. Like that would activate me. But just think about that as like, do you even have that option? If you're treating somebody, that you could pull something else. And luckily, many of these things are on YouTube, right? But what's the visual cues that you have going on? I think about that a lot, So, I mean, there's lots of different modalities that I would start to consider. This is the thing, in some ways, to answer that question, is go back to some of the things that I offered and think about, how can I reflect and integrate the connection to those things into which we're offered? And that would be some of the stuff that I'd start to think about. I seriously would be looking at, how do you do it generationally? If you have somebody that might be, the patient, but is there a way that you could look at some kind of treatment that involved kids? Because people respond to that very differently, right? And I think that if you're you got to realize the number of Native peoples. I have a good friend of mine here that they have 3 generations living in the house in Fort Collins. There's like 16 people living in that house, and they would not have it any other way, right? So where is it that you're bringing in the things that are very common, very at home? How do I bring that in, right? And not just that you have a kid visiting, but is there a way in which a kid can be part of the treatment? Because, a number of the kids want that relationship too. I don't know if it's put puzzles together, right? I mean, there's some tactileness and acuity, right? I'm literally pulling these things out, but I really think like some of those things, right? You can even have like, is the kid like doing blocks, but their kid's doing it, but the person who has the brain injury, right, is actually as part of that. That's some of the places I would go. Like, how do you replicate home, right?
Thank you, Susan.
You could start there. And again, I would start like, what's the stuff that's going on day by day that you can start to think about is like, how might I think about this in the ways in which breaks from the norm, breaks those boundaries, breaks those borders. Even identifying those borders and boundaries are huge, right? What's the obstacles? When I saw the barrier to support, again, I thought like the systematic ones, y'all probably know, but do you know, or is that an assumption? And particularly because they change, right? Because we put money in access, we've put money in a number of these other things. So have they changed, or are we continue to even like put extra resources, being redundant with resources where there's opportunities to do other things? I'd be looking at tapping in. There's a number of organizations, depends on where you are in Colorado, but they're popping up all over the place. Ask folks for what do they need? What's the help that's there today, right? Or the need today.
Okay, we're at 3:02. So does this feel like okay stopping place?
I want to thank Dr. Martinez for coming on. I appreciate that you're here.
Really.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martinez, for coming and we really appreciate all the time and energy and effort and sharing with us, and thank you.
Yeah, and I think the answer to the other question, Damien, is like, yeah, like this can't be it,
Mhm.
right? And I seriously think that one of the most important things an organization can do is structure the next step. Unless we structure the next step, it falls away.
Well, I have typed up a lot of what's been discussed into the document, and we will take this document with us and continue to work on it, and talk about this as an organization. So we really appreciate the time for this. Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody for coming on Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.